The pipe organ threw its voice toward the vaulted ceilings, a triumphant cascade that faltered, stuttered, and then tried once more as if sheer will could pull the day back into harmony. A cough ricocheted in the hush like a pebble down a canyon. On the other side of the heavy, carved doors of the bridal anteroom, the murmur of 300 guests swelled and faded, a tide of speculation and pity. Ava Monroe could hear every syllable as if the oak were parchment. "I heard he got cold feet. Poor thing. Can you imagine, in front of everyone?" Each whisper stuck to her like burrs. The dress she'd dreamed of since she was 12, a cloud of tulle, lace, and carefully chosen joy, suddenly felt like a costume for a play she no longer understood. She stood as still as a statue anchored in a storm. A ribbon of chill threaded up her spine, tight and unwavering. Her fiancé, Cole Keaton, was late. Not 5 minutes late, not swept up in the photographer late, an hour late. The kind of lateness that becomes a verdict. Hope, bright and unreasonable, still clung to the edges of her mind. Maybe a traffic snarl on the freeway, a flat tire, a dead phone. Hope shimmered, stubborn and present, and in that sliver of hope was a lifetime of plans she had knit with careful hands. Her father, pale beneath the proud lines of his tuxedo, couldn't keep still. He paced that little room in measured strides, like a man counting heartbeats, each turn punctuated by a glance at his daughter, as if memorizing her. "It's traffic, sweetheart," he said, voice gravel soft, trying on confidence like an old coat. "He'll be here." The lie sat between them like a third person. He squeezed her hand, a silent apology for a world he couldn't control. "I'll go find out what's happening." He slipped out the side door, leaving the scent of his aftershave and worry. Alone, the silence filled every corner with the throb of her pulse. Her phone, clenched in a hand going numb, buzzed once. A text from Cole. Her heartbeat stuttered, then galloped. She swiped. 4 words stared back, black and simple as a headstone. "I can't do this. Sorry." The floor tilted, the air thinned to nothing. The phone dropped, clattering across stone, echoing down into some well in her chest that had just cracked open. The sob that tore through her didn't sound like her at all. It was an animal sound, wounded and raw, clawing its way up her throat. She folded into a velvet chair as if gravity had doubled, her shoulders shaking with a grief that had no words and no edges. Waterproof mascara surrendered, charting black rivers down her cheeks to her jawline. The picture she had painted of her future, a home, a life, maybe children who would inherit her father's stubborn warmth, shattered against the cold fact of a text message. It was over, not the day, the story. The door of the waiting room eased inward on a whisper of hinges. She braced for her father's tender ruin of a face. It wasn't him. A guest stood there, a figure from fundraisers and hospital galas, from the periphery of a life that had never expected to meet him like this. He was tall. Even the doorway seemed to cooperate with his height. A shock of dark auburn hair caught a sliver of stained glass light, and his eyes, sea glass blue, startling and clear, took in her ruin without flinching. He wore his expensive suit with the kind of ease that looks like danger. Dr. Rowan Ashford, a brilliant, rarely seen neurosurgeon from Crescent Mercy Hospital, the hospital where her father sat on the board, and where powerful men spoke of surgeons like artists. She and Rowan had shaken hands once at a charity silent auction. His palm had been warm and steady, like a promise. He must have heard the whispers vibrating out there in the pews, the hum of speculation moving like lightning across a dry field. Rowan shut the door with a soft, decisive click that sealed out the world and left them in an unexpected, private hush. He didn't launch into condolences or platitudes. He crossed the small room with a wariness that felt like respect, his expression serious but not pitying, his gaze unnervingly gentle. He bent one knee and knelt, meeting her where she had fallen, his gaze steady at her eye level, like a doctor at the bedside of a terrified child. He smelled faintly of something expensive and understated, cedar and citrus. and underneath it, soap and surgical scrub. "They're waiting for a wedding, Ms. Monroe," he said, voice low and even, the kind of voice that slows a room's heartbeat. She looked up, tears blurring the edges of him, confusion pooling in the space where her anchor had been. "What?" Her voice found only a shred of volume. He didn't flinch. "A wedding," Rowan repeated, his eyes not leaving hers. Those eyes felt like the horizon, immense and far away and strangely steadying. "And I propose we give them one." The words for a moment didn't make sense. They floated in the air, unattached to reality, bizarre and shimmering, a mirage. Ava blinked. "What are you talking about?" She scraped trembling fingers across her cheeks, leaving pale, clean lines through the streaks. Her chest hurt, an ache wrapped in panic. Rowan's mouth didn't attempt reassurance. It shaped truth with a surgeon's precision. "Your fiancé is a coward," he said. There was no malice in it, only diagnosis. He chose to humiliate you in the most public way he could. But you don't have to let your dignity bleed out on this floor with your mascara. He tipped his head toward the wooden doors as if he could see through them. The guests who had flown in, the aunts clutching pearls, the college friends' refreshing group chats. There are people out there who got on planes to celebrate you. They came to toast the story of your joy. We can give them a wedding. I can be the groom they see. Her mind tried to fit this outrageous shape into logic and failed, and yet something in her heart leapt toward it like a drowning woman toward a floating piece of wood. "Why?" The word scraped out. "Why would you do that?" Something crossed his face, a flicker like a shadow of a memory, the tiniest tremor in the ocean blue of his eyes. "Maybe I need a miracle of my own today," he said, the corners of his mouth tightening around something enigmatic. "Or maybe," he added, and for a heartbeat his gaze softened, almost imperceptibly, "I can't stand to watch a good heart be crushed to entertain a room full of people." His hand emerged, palm up, the hand of a surgeon, capable, steady, the kind that can hold life and pain without shaking. "The choice is yours, Ava." Her name, in his low voice, startled something like hope in her. It sounded both too intimate and exactly right, as if he had said her name the way it was meant to be said. "You can walk out that door and be remembered forever as the girl who was left at the altar," he said. "Not cruel, just true. Or you can walk out as Mrs. Ashford." She stared at his hand, then at the oak doors, and her mind furnished pictures unasked. The hungry tilt of a gossip blogger's camera lens, the pitying crease between a friend's eyebrows, the smug twitch of a woman's mouth she had seen too many times with Cole. She imagined her father's face, the shame that would live in his posture long after she'd peeled this dress off. The humiliation was a black wave, cold and high, rushing toward her. Rowan's hand was a lifeline thrown from a ship she'd never planned to board. Not sane, not safe, not any of the things on the list she'd made to build a life, and the only thing within reach. In a moment that felt like both surrender and revolution, she reached up and set her trembling fingers in his palm. "Okay," she whispered. The word felt like stepping onto a bridge she hoped would appear under her feet. He nodded once, a small, satisfied arc, and stood, lifting her with him as if she weighed nothing. From inside his jacket he drew a square of immaculate linen, who even carried a handkerchief anymore, and with a tenderness that was almost clinical, he blotted away the mess grief had made of her face. The gesture was precise, impersonal, and yet it could not have felt more intimate. He leaned close, and his breath ghosted the shell of her ear, warm against the trembling skin there. "Pretend to marry me now," he whispered, 5 words like a fuse being lit. Then he turned, a clean pivot, and pulled the heavy doors open. The first bright notes of the wedding march poured into the room like sunlight. The murmuring inside the church fell into a silence so total it hummed. Rowan offered his arm, and his face reorganized itself back into the mask of a man absolutely certain of his next 3 moves. "Ready, wife?" he murmured, and there was a glint in those eyes, danger, humor, maybe both, that made something in her straighten. Together, they stepped from shadow into light, and onto the aisle that had seemed like a ribbon to her future only hours ago. Now it was a runway to the most beautiful lie she would ever tell, and perhaps the most honest thing she'd done, choosing herself, choosing not to be ruined. Gasps rose like birds startling from a field, a murmuring swell that trailed them the way her dress did. Her dress, her ridiculous too-much dress, caught the light and deceived the room. Here comes the bride. Ava fixed her gaze on the altar and did not look left or right, because if she saw faces, she might see pity, and if she saw pity, she might drown. Rowan's arm was linked with hers, an anchor she hadn't asked for that steadied her anyway. His presence was a wall against the weather of the room. At the front, her father stood, his face slack with bewilderment, as if someone had swapped out his life with an identical set of props, but a different script. As they reached him, Rowan bent subtly toward him, his voice for Ava's father's ears alone. "Trust me," he said. The words were not honeyed, they were simple, and edged with a certainty that shouldn't have been possible. He offered the slightest nod, something like a promise from a man who kept them, and, to Ava's shock, her father's panicked expression loosened. It didn't soften into joy, but it steadied. At the altar, the officiant, kindly, elderly, and now blinking like he had misplaced his bifocals, peered over his glasses at them as if they'd both grown antlers. "There's been a change of plans," Rowan said, voice low and threaded with an authority that brooked little argument. "Proceed with the ceremony." The officiant made a noise that was neither assent nor protest, fumbled with his book like a man finding his hands in a poorly lit theater, and cleared his throat. The ceremony blurred at the edges for Ava, as if she were underwater and the sound above was muffled, the words floating past like ribbons she couldn't grasp. When the time for vows came, her mind emptied out completely. The months she'd spent writing and rewriting promises to Cole, the humor and cold nights and shared spoons, and taking care of each other when the world got sharp. Those words shriveled into ash on her tongue. Panic nipped at her ribs. Rowan's fingers shifted against hers, a slight squeeze like a secret handshake. He turned to her as if they had practiced this. When he spoke, his voice was steady and clear, not theatrical, but beautiful in its restraint. "I, Rowan," he said, his gaze locked onto hers like a safety line, "take you, Ava, to be my wife." He went on, and the words he chose were simple and devastatingly apt for the surreal piece of theater they were playing, and the streak of reality running like molten metal through it. "I promise to honor you, to protect you from harm, and to be your safe harbor. When the world is uncertain, I will be your strength. When the world is sorrow, I will be your comfort. This I vow." It was improvisation that sounded truer than script. He gave her a blueprint. She took a breath that shook, but did not falter her voice. "I, Ava," she said, meeting the stranger's ocean eyes and recognizing in them something she didn't want to name. "Take you, Rowan, to be my husband. I promise to trust your strength, to accept your protection, even when pride tries to bite it, and to stand by your side today and in all our days to come." It wasn't the vow she had written. It felt like it might be the vow she had needed to make. The officiant, still floating somewhere between scandalized and enthralled, blinked hard and found his place in the script of every love story. "Then by the power vested in me," he said, voice catching, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." The noise of the church fell away like a curtain, as if the building itself had backed out and left them alone in a pocket of breath and light. Rowan lifted both hands to her veil and raised it with a care that made her swallow. His fingers brushed her cheeks, warm, unhurried. "Just for a moment," he murmured, the words for her alone. And then he kissed her. It wasn't a polite peck signed with a gentleman's flourish. It wasn't a stage kiss either. It was slow, deep, and shockingly claiming, as if he had every right to find his way into that space, but also all the restraint to not rush. One of his hands slid into her hair, anchoring her like he feared she might fly away if he didn't, and the other pressed lightly at the side of her jaw. Electricity sparked sharp and bright down her spine, quieting the crowd and the fear, and every thought that had been racing circles in her head. The kiss felt like a stake driven into the ground. Here, now. A line crossed that neither of them could uncross even if they wanted to. When he stepped back, his eyes were darker. Something unnameable met there. He took her hand again, firm and warm, like a guide leading her through a new city. "Come on, wife," he said in a low husk that skated over her skin. He led her back down the aisle, through a sea of faces gone silent with shock. Eyes wide, mouths parted, phone cameras forgotten at their sides. The outside air slapped them with bright sun and the taste of summer in the city. They reached the black limousine and slipped inside. The doors thudded closed with a soft, expensive finality. And suddenly the cacophony, the cameras, the mutters, the soundtrack of their not-ordinary wedding, muted down to the hum of the engine and the pulse in Ava's throat. The adoring groom mask Rowan had worn like a master's costume slid away, revealing the surgeon with clean lines and control you could build a house on. He ran a hand through his dark red hair, making it stand up at reckless, charming angles, and looked at her with a concern that was not performative at all. "Are you all right?" he asked. The warmth in his voice had relaxed into something plain and honest. The adrenaline that had carried Ava like a wave through those minutes receded fast, leaving her on wet sand, cold and exhausted. The whole brutal truth, left at the altar, humiliated in front of everyone, married to a stranger whose name she had only ever said over canapes, crashed over her and fucking knocked her flat. She nodded because speaking would have broken something. He watched her face, the fissures in her composure widening, and then, quietly, gently, he withdrew another crisp handkerchief and set it into her palm like a tool. He turned his face to the window, gave her his shoulder and his silence like a gift. He did not reach for her hair, or for empty words that would ring like tin. He created a small cathedral of privacy around her, while she cried in quiet waves, letting go of a future she'd embroidered with a girl's neat stitches, terrified of the one rushing toward her. The silence stretched, full of her breathing and the set of his jaw, and the fine leather scent of a life that wasn't hers 10 minutes ago. When her sobs had tapered into shivers, and the well had emptied enough to see the bottom, he spoke again. "I didn't do that just for you," he said, voice steady in a way that told her he was moving them from cliff-edge emotion back to solid ground. "I had my own reasons." Ava lifted her head, eyes red-rimmed, and searching his face for the thing behind those words. "I am in need of a wife," he said, getting right to the point with the bluntness she suspected he used in operating rooms. "My family, and, more importantly, the board at Crescent Mercy where I'm being considered for chief of surgery, like the optics of stability. Marriage calms their concerns. It ends the constant matchmaking my mother conducts like a hobby." He looked at her directly. It felt like standing in sunlight. "A sudden romance with a woman I refuse to let be publicly shamed gives them a narrative they can bless. Unexpected. Romantic. Traditional enough to keep their donors delighted." He exhaled, something like a wall of resolve settling into place. "I'm proposing an arrangement," he said. 1 year. We present as a united, convincing couple in public. We maintain boundaries in private. At the end, we separate amicably. Irreconcilable differences, discreetly handled. We go our own ways." The words were the most clinical proposal she had ever heard, and yet they were somehow a life raft, built with blueprints and screws. "And in return," she asked, the question small like she was testing the floor for creaks. "In return," he said, "I provide financial security for you during that year, a generous allowance, a private place to live, and the means to disappear from the public eye until the scandal burns itself out and you can start fresh. This is business dressed in a tuxedo." It was insult and salvation twisted together. He was essentially offering to pay her to act as his wife, and he was offering her the dignity of not being the woman everyone whispered about over brunch. "Why me?" she asked again. It beat inside her chest like a second heartbeat. "You could have anyone." He stared at a spot beyond her shoulder, analytical, like he was solving a problem. "Because you were a variable I couldn't have predicted," he said. "Therefore, the most believable choice. No one would suspect orchestration. He paused. When he went on, his voice dropped a fraction. And because for 1 second in that room before you cried, I saw your eyes, he said. You weren't just heartbroken. You were furious and fearless. You were choosing not to be small. He leaned just a hair forward. You looked like the bravest person I'd ever seen. He held her gaze. Do we have a deal, Mrs. Ashford? The name startled her, as sure as if he had thrown cold water on her face. She wasn't Ava Monroe, abandoned girl, anymore. She was Mrs. Ashford, wife of a man who seemed to believe in contracts more than anything else. An actor signed up for the performance of her life. She inhaled, slow and deep. We have a deal, she said, and watched the corner of his mouth move as if he'd allowed himself a millimeter of relief. The limousine slipped into the underground garage of a sleek tower that owned the skyline like a shard of ice. Rowan's penthouse took up the top floor, an expanse of concrete that gleamed, furniture sculpted to disappear, and a wall of glass that put the city on display like a jewel he'd taken from a dragon. Ava was still in layers upon layers of fabric and buttons, a queen in exile. The dress that had once symbolized everything light and tender now felt like armor she was dying to climb out of. Let me show you your room, Rowan said, and even his voice had a faint echo in the huge space. They moved down a gallery white hallway that softened the sound of their footsteps. He stopped at double doors. The East Wing, he said, and it made her want to laugh because how many people had wings in their homes? Your suite is here, bedroom, bath, a study. Complete privacy. He paused like a man who knows the knife is sharp. My rooms are in the West Wing, opposite end. The message was neat and precise. Shared space, separate lives. Inside, the suite was perfect in a catalog shoot way. Muted gray and cream, expensive linens, a view that made the city seem like a toy. It looked like absolutely no one lived in it. We need rules, Rowan said, turning to face her. There was nothing flirty in him now. This was man with clipboard energy. Clear ones. He paced slowly, hands in his pockets, voice even. Rule 1. Separate lives. In this house, we are business partners. No prying, no encroaching. The East Wing is yours, the West is mine. He stopped and met her eyes. Rule 2. A flawless public performance. In public, we are devoted and convincing. You will smile, you will hold my hand when it's expected, you will look at me like I matter. He began to move again like a metronome. And Rule 3, the most important. No questions about the past. Yours or mine. Our story begins today. Everything before is irrelevant to this arrangement. The rules were elegant in their cruelty. They built a wall with a window the size of a thumbnail to look through. He was telling her that she would bear his name, but not enter his life. Do you understand? He asked, voice still soft, but edged with something that said he needed her to. Ava swallowed. I understand. He glanced at her gown, a complicated miracle of satin and buttons. Something flickered over his face that might have been sympathy, might have been annoyance. You'll need help with that, he said. Practical, efficient. He moved behind her. Turn. She turned, feeling like a wind-up ballerina who'd been reset to a different tune. She heard his breath, and then his hands found the line of buttons at the base of her neck. Silk-covered, endless, a tiny nightmare she hadn't considered when she'd chosen the dress. With steady, careful motions, he began unfastening one by one. It should have felt clinical. It didn't. The intimacy of being undressed by a stranger, even one who had just become her husband, was a shell around her chest, tight and breath-shortening. When his knuckles brushed her spine, it was a spark as unexpected as ice water down her back. She flinched before she could stop herself, a reflex. His hands stilled for a heartbeat. He didn't comment. He continued, his movements a fraction faster, the rhythm slightly less smooth. She could feel the heat of him behind her, the clean scent of soap and cologne teasing at something low in her belly. The only sound was the faint pop of buttons releasing. tiny, quiet explosions that filled the room like rain on a tin roof. At the last button at the small of her back, his fingers grazed her skin, one final bright little jolt. Like static shocked into two bodies, it was acknowledgement of something neither of them had admitted out loud, something their rules had tried to preempt. He stepped back quickly, like a man who hadn't meant to stand too close to a fire. "Good night, Ava," he said, voice rougher than it had been. He left the room without looking back, leaving her in a ring of lamplight and lace, buzzing with the ghost of his touch, and the entire weight of what she had done pressing against her lungs. The arrangement's first test arrived not as a whisper, but as a summons printed on thick cream cardstock, delivered by a driver in a black suit, whose expression betrayed nothing. Dinner, Vivian Ashford required the presence of her son and his bride. Rowan watched from her doorway as Ava fastened a pair of diamond earrings that were not hers by any definition she'd used before, lit in the mirror by the patience he wore. "My mother doesn't care for surprises," he said, leaning a shoulder on the doorframe. "She is used to conducting the room. She'll be looking for weakness, don't give her any." The Ashford estate was what old money builds to remind itself of its lineage. Stone warmed by sun, long hallways of paintings of people who looked like they never smiled, the faint scent of beeswax and paper and authority. Vivian Ashford was cut like a sculpture, elegant in the way of women who know precisely how much they cost and exactly who paid it. And her eyes were the same unsettling blue as her son's, though colder. Smiles hovered at her mouth but never arrived in her eyes. Sloane Ashford, Rowan's younger sister, was there too, a sharper, hungrier version of their mother, in a dress that could wound. Her mouth curved in permanent skepticism. Dinner tasted like interrogation served with a reduction sauce. "So, Ava," Vivian began lightly, voice smooth as satin but with a blade sewn into the hem, "Rowan tells us nothing. How did you two meet? It all felt so sudden." Ava felt her heartbeat knock against her ribs. The first real scene. She looked to Rowan. He nodded once, a small signal. They'd studied their script like crammers before a final. "At a charity event," Ava said, summoning the backstory they'd cobbled together. "A few months ago, I was there with a friend. Rowan was very charming." Sloane laughed, the sound like glass. "Charming isn't a word I'd throw at my brother," she said, smiling in a way that wasn't. "He's more of the brooding, emotionally unavailable type." "Sloane?" Rowan said, tone even enough to still a pond. The questions came steady after that, drifting between pleasant and pointed, her family, her work. They had chosen freelance art consultant for her, and Ava wore the story with as much ease as she could muster. Their whirlwind courtship, jazz concerts, gallery openings, late-night takeout eaten on a penthouse floor. She answered, feeling cross-examined and barely winning. It was Vivian's final question that slid neatly like a knife between her ribs. "Tell me, dear," she said with a tilt of her head. "My son could have anyone he wanted. What exactly made you fall in love with him so quickly?" Any answer that sounded like she adored his money or his status would confirm what the room wanted to think. Opportunist. The silence stretched, taut. Ava could feel Rowan's gaze on her, weighty and waiting. She did not go hunting for the line they had crafted. She thought instead of a man with red hair adrift in stained glass light, kneeling like a knight in the only kind of rescue that would not crush her. She turned to Vivian, meeting steel eyes with something unexpected even to herself. "On the day we decided to get married," she said, voice quiet, steadying itself, "I was having the worst day of my life. I felt small, invisible, alone in a building full of people." She looked briefly at Rowan and let the softness she felt flicker to the surface. "Your son didn't see a pathetic girl. He saw someone worth rescuing without making her feel like a damsel. He showed me kindness when I wasn't looking for it. He handed me strength when I had none of my own." She looked back at Vivian. How could I not fall in love with a man like that? The room went still in the way of rooms recalibrating. Sloane glanced down at her plate and didn't toss a single barb. Vivian's cool gaze faltered into something like respect, thin and rare. Rowan was staring at Ava like she'd slipped past a barrier he'd erected, shock and something else on his face, something that looked suspiciously like awe. Later, in the foyer of Rowan's glass and concrete eyrie, their steps echoed in the hush of a space that felt larger at night. "You did well," he said, voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "I wasn't lying," she answered, studying the marble at their feet. "You were kind." The silence that fell wasn't the brittle quiet of two people balancing on rules. It was a full silence, heavy with truth they weren't ready to name. The awareness that her performance had been a confession that caught him more off guard than any headline. Weeks grew bones and muscle and became a new rhythm. Their public choreography smoothed, the touch of his hand on the small of her back, at benefits a language. Privately, the space between them loosened. Jokes began to take up residence. Arguments about the virtues of coffee versus tea sparkled. And always, there was the dinner table confession like a river at the edge of their property, present, moving, undefinable. The outside world, meanwhile, had opened its 1,000 eyes. The story of Ava's first failed wedding hadn't faded like a bruise. It had become a ghost that enjoyed slamming doors. Cole Keaton, her ex, did not dry up and blow away as she'd imagined. The woman he assumed would be pining in a studio apartment instead found herself photographed in sleek sedans beside a man the city called its most eligible, and the Department of Gossip labeled untouchable. Cole, who loved mirrors, did not like what they were showing him now. He had gone from being the guy who dumped Ava Monroe to the fool who let Mrs. Rowan Ashford slip. Regret curdled with pride, and like milk left in sun too long, it soured into something explosive. He showed up at Crescent Mercy Hospital, strolling across marble as if his last name still had power enough to open any door. He leaned an elbow on the front desk and demanded to see his fiancée, Ava, like the last few months had been an annoying software update he could uninstall. Security called upstairs, voice tight. "Dr. Ashford," the chief said, "there's a man in the lobby demanding to see your wife. Claims he's her fiancé." There was a stillness in Rowan's office that was not quiet. It was the kind of silence that has teeth. "Keep him there," Rowan said, calm dropping 10 degrees. "I'm on my way." Ava was in pediatrics, having slipped into a routine of reading to sick kids on Thursdays because it was a way to set her heart down and not think about cameras. A nurse came, breathless. "You have a visitor in the lobby." Ava took the elevator down, heart climbing up her throat when she saw Cole's posture. A sixth sense whispered, "Run." Before she could pick a direction, Rowan appeared, cutting in between her and Cole without breaking stride. "Stay behind me," he said under his breath, and Ava obeyed, surprised and irritated with herself for liking the safety his body provided. Rowan approached Cole with the leisurely grace of a big cat that knows it runs the savannah. "Cole," Rowan said mildly, "you're lost." "Not lost, Ashford," Cole sneered, trying to repack his swagger. "I'm here for my fiancée." "This has nothing to do with you." "That," Rowan said, stopping a precise distance away, "is where you're wrong." His voice chilled until words crystallized and fell. "Everything that concerns Ava concerns me. The woman you left standing in front of 300 people is my wife. She carries my name. She has my protection." He stepped 1 inch closer. Cole flinched. "You will not call her. You will not approach her or her father. You will not hover at the edges of rooms, hoping for apologies you don't deserve. This is your first and only warning." He leaned in, voice dropping to a thread, lethal. "I have the patience of a doctor when I'm holding a scalpel. As a husband?" His mouth curved in something that wasn't a smile. "Not so much." "Leave." Cole's color leached. He spun and hustled right out of the hospital like his life depended on it. Rowan stood, shoulders rigid, hands turning to fists and back again. Then he turned to Ava and the ice left his eyes. "Are you okay?" he asked. She could only nod. She had seen him be charming and precise and kind. She had not seen this version, fierce and territorial, a protector wearing a growl. It should have terrified her. Instead, some deep, wordless part of her unfurled like a cat in sun. The moment in the lobby became something they didn't say aloud but thought about at odd hours, a small shared ember shifting the temperature of rooms. He had not stepped in because of optics or contract. He had stepped in like a man moved by a clause he never wrote. It unsettled her and made her feel, for the first time in months, solid. Ava began spending afternoons in Rowan's library, when the camera vans clustered outside finally tired and moved on to fresher scandals. The library was a surprise, a room of wood and warmth in a home of stone and steel. Floor-to-ceiling shelves held medical texts and biographies of world changers. But at the back was a crooked little shelf with a dust layer and the weight of memory. Old yearbooks slumped in a stack, the spines cracked, the leather glossy with age. One rainy day, when the city looked like a watercolor and thunder muttered at the windows, Ava pulled down a yearbook whose gold letters said Briarfield Preparatory. She carried it to a chair by the window, the rain stitching a soundtrack to discovery, and opened it. Pages of young faces grinned, the children of the city's architects and law partners, teeth too big, promises too wide. Her fingers trailed over them like a fortune teller's, and then, there, a young Rowan Ashford, hair longer, sharp edges softened by youth, those unmistakable blue eyes already looking 15 steps ahead in a science club photo. The fondness that rose in her surprised her. She liked imagining him shy, awkward even. Then her gaze ticked to the boy beside him, an arm slung with unconscious affection around Rowan's shoulders, grin wide as summer. The name beneath the photo made the room tilt. Ethan Monroe. The book slid from her fingers and hit the polished floor with a slap that should have woken ghosts. It couldn't be. Ethan Monroe was her brother, brilliant, funny, adored, a comet that had burned out on a dark road when she was little. A wound that her family had let scar over without ever saying the word accident longer than 2 syllables. Her hands shook as she picked the book back up, opened it again, stared. Rowan and Ethan, laughing, sunlit, teenage friendship, pinned to paper like disbelieving butterflies. Her mind turned into a machine, generating questions. Rowan had known her brother. He had said nothing. He had stood in that waiting room, heard Ava Monroe, and not even blinked? Rule 3 thundered in her skull. No questions about the past. The clause suddenly looked less like a boundary around privacy and more like a wall built to hide a body. She flipped pages frantically, heart whacking her ribs, and found another photo, the debate team, caught mid-laughter. Rowan and Ethan sat shoulder to shoulder, heads tipped together as if in conspiracy. In the background, out of focus, a little blonde girl, her, looked at them like planets. He had known who she was. He had known from the moment he walked into that church. Their entire arrangement was not born of random kindness, but something else entirely, something deeper and stranger and more dangerous. She stood alone in the warm quiet of the library with the weight of the yearbook in her hands and her brother's immortal smile on the page speaking a language that felt a lot like accusation. The life she had rebuilt on a scaffolding of public performance and private tenderness cracked audibly. He had known. The thought turned into a heat source inside her, anger cold and hard, anger born of betrayal that felt like a cut you don't feel until you see the blood. She snapped the yearbook closed. The sound was an explosion in the room. She moved, purpose distilling inside her like vodka. She found Rowan in his study, lit by the glow of scans on a wall-sized monitor, focus honed to a point that could cut glass. He looked up, startled by the force of her entrance, and, in 2 strides, she was at his desk, slamming the yearbook onto the lacquer. He flinched at the crack of it, his gaze dropping to the open page. "Who is this, Rowan?" she asked. Her voice was low, vibrating with a fury she was holding by a thread. He looked down. Color fled his face like someone had opened a drain. The mask he wore better than anyone cracked, and terror poked through it, raw and panicked, the face of a man who has seen a ghost. "Ava, I don't," she snapped, the word loud enough to set the glassware ringing. "Don't you dare lie to me." "Not this time." "You knew him," she said, each word measured, heavy. "You knew my brother." Rowan's gaze wouldn't come up. He stared at Ethan's grin, and his shoulders rounded under a weight he'd carried too long. "Yes," he said, barely sound and more confession than word. And you knew who I was, she pushed, and her voice broke and then rebuilt itself out of shards. In the church, that day, you knew I was his sister, and you said nothing. It's complicated, he said, raking a hand through his hair, a gesture that looked like desperation's twin. The rules, she laughed, and the sound was a blade. You think this is about your rules? This is about my brother, my family, the night that cracked us open and poured us out. You were part of his life. You hid that from me like a coward hides a weapon. She moved around the desk, orbiting him, grief and betrayal turning into kinetic energy in her body. Was this a game? Some awful penance? Did you see me crushed and decide to save your best friend's little sister because on some cosmic list you owed a debt? No, he said, finally lifting his head and meeting her eyes with a pain that mirrored hers. It wasn't like that. Then what was it? She demanded. Tell me the truth for once in this performance we call a marriage. The goddamn truth, he stood, the carefully curated composure blowing apart. You want the truth? He said, the words ripped from his chest. Ethan was my best friend. The only real friend I ever had. And I was with him the night he died. The room lurched. Ava's hand flew to her mouth. What? I was in the car, he said, and the breaking in his voice felt like it had been waiting a decade for permission. Passenger seat. I was there. Everything inside her that had been holding for dear life let go. The man she'd married, the man she had watched be protective and sharp and careful, had been with her brother in that cold, terrible moment when the world had become before and after. What happened? She whispered, horror blooming new. What really happened to Ethan? The study filled with ghosts, old and insistent. Rowan looked at her and understood that the wall he had built around that night, brick by secret brick, was crumbling. He sat back down like the floor had shifted under him, and stealing strength felt like honesty. We were 17, he said, voice low and haunted. We thought we were bulletproof. We had just won the state debate championship. Ethan was driving. We were so happy. He stared at nothing, the far wall dissolving into a wet black road. It was late, rain coming down in sheets. We were on our way back from a party. We weren't drinking. We weren't doing anything stupid. We were just loud kids in a car, singing along to bad music. His breath hitched. A car came out of nowhere. It ran a red light, he said. Fast. A black sedan. It hit us on the driver's side. He closed his eyes and the sound filled the room, the shriek of metal, the glass, the sudden brutal silence afterward. I woke up in the hospital a day later, he said, voice emptying. Broken arm, concussion, ribs, alive. He swallowed. Ethan was pronounced dead at the scene. Ava was ice and heat, numb and burning. The police report, Rowan said, voice turning hard, old anger reanimating. Work of fiction, said Ethan lost control on a wet road, single car accident, a tidy tragedy. They never mentioned the other driver. The black sedan didn't exist by the time the ink dried. But you saw it, Ava said, the words part question, part plea. I saw it, he said, and now the bitterness in his voice was for himself. I told them, the police, my parents, anyone. But the man in that black car was a ghost. He finally looked at her, and his eyes were full of a decade of rage that had nowhere to go. Except he wasn't. He was Judge Harold Keaton, a powerful, connected man with a filing cabinet full of drunk driving that got quietly erased. And that night, he wasn't just drunk. He was fleeing the scene of another problem. Rowan's mouth twisted. His son Cole, he said, tasting the name like poison, had been at the same party. He'd gotten into a fight, and Keaton had been called to collect him before uniforms arrived. He was driving drunk with his son in the car when he ran that light and killed my friend. The name of the judge's son hung there like a sword falling in slow motion. Ava knew it before he said it, the gut-level knowing of a life coming full circle in the worst possible way. Who was his son? She asked anyway, voice shaking. Cole, Rowan said. Cole Keaton, your ex. The world stopped moving. The man who had left her at the altar had been in the car that had destroyed her family's center. The web of her life, threads she'd thought were independent, snapped into a net she couldn't ignore. "My parents," she said, voice thin. "Did they know?" "No," Rowan said, and his voice softened into something unbearably kind. "Keaton's influence was absolute. He and my father reached an agreement, a settlement for my family, a promise that my testimony, confused and concussed, would be set aside." He stood and moved to the window, back to her. "My father took the deal to avoid a war we couldn't win. He buried the truth to protect me and our name." His shoulders rose and fell once. "I became a doctor because of that night," he said, and the emotion in him filled the room to its corners. "To save what I couldn't save, to do penance for a truth I couldn't drag into the light." He turned back, eyes wet. "When I saw you at that altar, perfect and broken, being humiliated by the son of the man who killed your brother, I couldn't let him hurt your family again. It wasn't chess, it wasn't strategy. It was a promise I made in my bones to Ethan once, that I would look out for his little sister. I failed him that night. I wasn't going to fail again." Ava understood then that the marriage had not been whim, but penance, not rescue, but protection, not romance, but a wild attempt to set a story right a decade too late. Her heart cracked open, grief spilling out not as pain but as recognition. She was in love with a man whose whole life had been bent around the same absence that bent hers. Their pasts weren't just linked, they were the same story with two narrators crying different parts. The confession left them jagged and raw, the wind ripping through a room where a wall had been. The secrets that once divided them were gone, replaced with a thin, aching intimacy. For the first time, they weren't playing husband and wife. They were two survivors who had finally found each other in the wreckage. Outside, the city was not changing its speed because two people were. Cole Keaton, humiliation metastasizing, decided that if he went down, he'd take company. He had one last weapon, truth warped enough to wound without drawing his own blood. He didn't go to the police. He wasn't an idiot about self-incrimination. He went to the press. A gossip columnist of notorious appetite took his call. Cole spun a story that used the right names and wrong roles. The headline screamed across screens within hours. "Billionaire surgeon's dark secret. Did Dr. Ashford's deadly past lead to a wedding of lies?" The article quoted an anonymous source close to the family and painted night in colors unrecognizable. It said Rowan had been behind the wheel. It said his family had used power to pin the blame on dead Ethan. It recast Ava as a woman who had sold her brother's memory for a penthouse and a last name. It was malicious fiction wrapped around a rotten core of fact. The accident, the cover-up, the whirlwind marriage, twisted so that the villain wore Rowan's face and Ava was his complicit prize. Chaos followed, as it always does. Hospital board members called emergency sessions. Reporters set up camp outside their building, cameras glinting like beetle eyes. Social media did what it does best, burned without checking where the gasoline came from. Rowan's reputation, a thing he had built brick by careful brick, was kicked like a sandcastle by strangers with feet. He was no longer brilliant, controlled, lethal in the best way. He was a monster with a scalpel in the story people wanted to tell. Ava was a gold digger. Their carefully crafted narrative, the public kindness, the tender glances, was turned into evidence against them. The penthouse stopped being a home and became a fortress under siege. The world narrowed to the space between Rowan's study and the kitchen island where Ava sat and read comment sections she had no business reading. The hospital board scheduled an emergency ethics hearing. Suspension, license review, words that sounded like drowning. Vivian Ashford swept into the penthouse like winter, her mouth a slash. She didn't come to gather her son into any kind of maternal shelter. She came with strategy, like a weapon drawn. "You must divorce her," she said, voice crisp as ice cracking. "Immediately. Issue a statement that you were deceived, that you only just learned of her connection to the accident. Paint her as an opportunist who preyed on your kindness. It's the only way to create distance and salvage your career.
Ava heard it from the doorway and felt her stomach crumple. Even now, the preservation of the brand mattered more than the truth.
No, Rowan said. The word a growl dragged from low in his body. I won't throw her to the wolves. Then you are a fool, Vivian said. She will be your ruin. He said nothing, his jaw clenched and unclenched. The date for the hearing fell on the calendar like a black circle. Everyone expected a public execution. The story was simply too delicious for any other ending. That morning, Rowan tied his tie with fingers that didn't shake and looked like a man walking willingly into the ocean. Ava stepped in front of him. I'm coming with you, she said. Her voice had a steadiness in it he hadn't heard since she'd faced him in his study and demanded the truth. No, he said, and the gentleness in it threatened to shred her. You don't need to be a part of this. I won't let them tear you apart. You don't have a choice, she said, eyes green fire. You made a vow to protect me. Now it's my turn. They walked into the boardroom side by side. 12 faces sat around a gleaming table, lined with water pitchers and legal pads, and the smell of judgment. The chairman cleared his throat, voice grave as a funeral. Dr. Ashford, we are here to discuss the allegations. Before you begin, Ava said, and her voice cut through the room like a clean line. There is something you all need to hear. Heads turned, surprised out of their certainty. My name is Ava Monroe, she said. Ethan Monroe was my brother. She took a breath that pulled courage from every part of her body and scattered it across the table like confetti. The story you've read is a lie, she said, but it's wrapped around a terrible truth that has been buried for more than a decade. She told them everything. Harold Keaton, Cole, the black sedan, the cover-up, the way the system had squared itself around power and squeezed her family out of any justice. She told them about Rowan not as a villain, not as a savior, but as a boy who had carried a night like an anchor until he found a way to forge it into a compass. You've accused this man of buying my silence, she said, voice rising, catching light like a blade. You're wrong. He gave me my voice back. He gave my brother the justice he was denied. He is the most honorable man I know. Her body shook with the adrenaline of telling the truth in a room that had expected a script. She picked a side, his, and she did it publicly, completely, without hedging. Silence fell. Not awkward, not uncertain, reverent. The board members looked at her like they'd been baptized in cold water. Her testimony didn't just defend Rowan, it torched the narrative Cole had hand-fed to a hungry press. In the weeks that followed, the truth, buoyed by her willingness to say it aloud, came out of hiding. An internal investigation quietly unearthed the bones, reports, phone calls, conveniently lost evidence. Harold Keaton took early retirement and slid into the shadows of disgrace. Cole's family name, formerly a ticket to rooms where doors appeared, became a punchline writ in ash. Cole himself drifted out of the city like smoke. Rowan's name was cleared. The board issued a statement of support that used words like integrity and leadership, without the practiced hollowness such words often have. He was unanimously voted chief of surgery, and for once, the power felt like it sat in the right hands. He and Ava became the city's favorite couple, not because they glowed at parties, but because their story had acquired the sheen that comes after fire, muted and strong and real. Then, 3 months after the hearing, on the 1-year anniversary of the most unorthodox wedding anyone could remember, Rowan came home with a leather folder. Our year is up, he said quietly. Our agreement is fulfilled. You are free. The words landed like ice water under her ribs. After everything, they were still honoring the contract? Is this what you want? She asked, voice careful around glass. It's what we agreed, he said, not answering and answering. I promised you freedom. I won't break this promise. Not to you. He slid the folder toward her. He was giving her the one choice that mattered, the one he'd built his new self around, consent. She looked at the papers that would dismantle the life they'd built. Then she looked at him, the man who had saved her in a church, by offering a new story when hers had stopped mid-sentence.
the man she had saved back in a room with 12 skeptical faces, by telling the truth that had almost killed them both. She picked up the pen. Her heart climbed into her throat and pounded there while she signed her name neatly on the line that made their divorce official. She slid the papers across the table to him. Pain flashed across his face, so quick she might have missed it if she hadn't been waiting to feel the blade herself. And then his expression was calm. She straightened and set the pen down like a gavel. "Now that our business is concluded," she said, voice steady and clearer than she felt, "I have a proposal for you, Dr. Ashford." He looked up, frown creasing his perfect forehead. She took a breath and walked around the table until she was in front of him. She went down on one knee. The glass walls held the moment like breath. "Rowan Ashford," she said, eyes bright with love so certain it made his chest ache. "You saved me from the worst day of my life. You gave me a family when mine was drowning. You gave me a voice when I couldn't find it. Our contract is over, so now I'm asking for a new one." She smiled up at him, her whole face a prayer and an answer. "Marry me," she whispered, "for real, forever." Rowan stared, his brilliant mind blanking like a screen reset. He had built his expectations like a scaffold. He had prepared for the wrench and the dark and the door closing. He had not allowed himself this picture, Ava on one knee, offering him a future. A slow, disbelieving smile stretched across his face until he looked younger, softer, like the boy in the yearbook. He reached down and took her hands, tugged her up. "Get up, you fool," he whispered, voice thick with the kind of tears that mean relief. He pulled her into his arms and buried his face in her hair. "Yes," he said, against her skin. "Yes, yes, yes."
Their second wedding was the inverse of their first. No organ. No church with history soaked into its pews. No audience full of murmurs. They gathered on a beach where the sand warmed bare feet, and the sunset painted the sky in layers of peach and lavender. Only people who mattered stood in a small circle. Ava's father, whose smile looked like it might split his face. Vivian, eyes softer, a woman warmed by seeing her son saved from his own steel. A handful of friends who had stood with them in small rooms and told truths. Ava wore a white sundress that moved the way waves do, easy, honest. Rowan wore linen and rolled his pants cuffs and laughed when the first wave lapped at his ankles like a puppy. Their vows weren't performances built for an audience. They were private, whispered like secrets you can only tell when the wind carries them right. "I promise to be your safe harbor," Rowan said, sliding a simple, elegant band onto her finger. "But the truth is, you always were mine." "I promise to stand by you," Ava whispered, giving him a matching band. "There isn't a place in the world I'd rather be than in this life with you." The officiant, this time a friend with bare feet and a bright smile, pronounced them husband and wife without trembling. The kiss that followed was neither shocking nor possessive. It was home. Later, in a beach house that smelled like lemon oil and salt air, Rowan tugged Ava into a corner. "I have a wedding present for you," he said, an irreverent light in his eyes that meant surprise. He handed her a leather folder. The muscle memory in her body flinched, thinking of contracts. She opened it carefully. Inside, a deed and charter. "The Ethan Monroe Foundation," she read aloud, and her breath hitched. "It's for legal aid and support for families of drunk driving victims," he said softly. "For the people who don't get heard. So that they have a voice your family never did." Tears ran down her face as if the ocean had chosen a new course through her. He had taken the worst night and turned it into a promise stitched to their future. Not a secret, hope. 1 year later, Ava stood at a podium in an auditorium lit so bright it felt like daylight. She was not the girl with a shaking voice in a library. She was the executive director of the Ethan Monroe Foundation, eloquent and fierce, telling a room full of people how justice sometimes needs a push and how grief can be spun into gold if you hold it hard enough. In the front row, her father and Vivian sat shoulder to shoulder, both of them proud in a quiet way that looked like exhale. Off to the side, out of spotlight, Rowan stood, watching his wife like a man who knows he's in the presence of a miracle. He had seen her broken. Now he got to see her brilliant.
power gathered into her hands like light. After the ribbon cutting, after the congratulations and hugs, he rested his arms around her waist and pressed his lips to her temple. "Ethan would be so proud of you," he whispered. "He'd be proud of us," she said, leaning back into him. That night, their penthouse felt like a home fully inhabited. Plants, mismatched mugs, art done by kids whose hospital rooms Ava had decorated. On the balcony, the city sparkled and the night held its breath over them. Rowan came up behind her and set his palm gently on her stomach, now rounded in a way that made every morning a new kind of wonder. "A new legacy," he murmured, cheek on her hair. She turned, eyes full of sky. Their story, blonde and redhead, abandoned and rescuer, had been built on a whisper in a church. Now it was made of 1,000 truths. "I was thinking about a name," she said, covering his hand with hers. "Oh?" He smiled, mischief and tenderness braided together. "I thought we agreed on Samuel if it's a boy." "We did," she said, eyes bright. "But if it's a girl, I was thinking of Etta." His breath caught. Etta, a name that held Ethan inside it like a secret promise. He looked at his wife, at their home, at a world reborn by the truth they had insisted on, and the ache inside him loosened. The circle that began on a rain-slick road had finally closed and opened again. This time around a life they were building brick by unglamorous brick. He kissed her, slow and full of an awe he didn't bother hiding. "I love it," he whispered against her smile. "It's perfect."